The biggest spiritual mistake that I see college freshmen make, say that 10 times fast, is spiritual bypassing. This is the use of spiritual practices or beliefs as addiction or avoidance of painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs rationalized through spirituality. We think that spirituality should make us feel better. Over the long term, it does, but often it's used as a rationalization rather than a means to meet pain, growth, and trauma. And it's not fully our fault. The reality is that many spiritual traditions, if they even exist in college, aren't developed enough yet to see the ways that spiritual bypassing is baked into their bread. Most human cultures reward spiritual bypassing instead of recognizing it and appreciating how to navigate it. So, in this video, I'm going to illuminate to you the 3 spiritual bypassing traps which I experienced all inside of college and how we can navigate them in college so we don't fall as much for spiritual bypassing as we might. Let's boogie. The first big trap is mistaking states for structures. There's a particular story which goes with this one. That was in my last semester of my last college year, senior year. I decided, you know what would be a good idea? Right as I am going through one of the most difficult romantic relationship experiences in my life, let's do a mushrooms trip. Yeah, let's do. That's a good idea. And so this is how I experienced the worst trip of my entire life. I had a good experience for the first 30 minutes until I awoke in the realization that I had no idea where I was, why I was there, and what the heck was going on. And imagine this feeling of having some semblance that you know what you are and who you're meant to be, but not being able to really reach it. You see all these objects that remind you of you, but can't parse what the heck they actually are. I felt like the underground man in Dostoevsky's novel, just going slowly more and more and more insane. And the main problem here was thinking that I had to do something extreme to build my spirituality more. I can't just sit still and do nothing in my room, on top of doing it during a difficult romantic period. That is not a good idea either. But the mistake here is mistaking states for structures. States are temporary experiences where we see reality differently. This mushrooms experience is a state because, at least I hope, when you are done with mushrooms, which this video is not a go do mushrooms video, that's outside of the scope of this. That is a state. A structure is your groundedness in how you perceive reality. And importantly, being in a state experience does not mean that you're structured in that state. So another good example of this is transcending but not integrating as a spiritual bypassing challenge. An example is monks that are deeply state aware, some of the most state aware people in the world, but they don't have, for example, great structure in relational intelligence because they've protected themselves from really immersing in society. Like, I'd like to see a monk argue about politics. That would be quite the sight. And this is because they haven't grounded in that structure from being in society for longer. Another example of this mistake is focusing exclusively on our spiritual development at the expense of our other lines. So, for example, for a while, I focused too much on what Ken Wilber calls the interior individual quadrant of spirituality rather than the collective interior. I focused a lot on my emotions, my mind, my self-understanding and didn't realize how important it was to connect that to my relational intelligence because it pools into there, it plays into there a lot. Another example is looking for shortcuts to enlightenment. You get into spirituality, you're like, yes, I'm just going to start glowing and floating as fast as I can. That's the whole point, right? And so that mushrooms trip was really a good example of that. But real spirituality is unglamorous. It's picking your boogers in between awakenings. It's real, just mundane, boring stuff, because that's how you structure the spirituality into your everyday college life instead of having it consolidated in just these awakening state experiences. Real freedom is not about having no limitations. It's about finding liberation through limitation. It's about learning to be spiritual even when you're taking a shit, when you're walking to class, all the unglamorous things. And that is the problems with state and structure, the first trap. But another huge one is avoiding pain and needs through spirituality. For example, acting as if your survival needs, they don't matter. You're too spiritual for them. You don't need to money? Who needs money? Who needs a shelter? Who needs food when you can just reunite with the oneness of the universe? I fell for this a bit when I was in 11th grade. I valued money too much. I really wanted to become financially free. And then as I got out of this self-improvement period of mine through 11th grade and 12th grade and the beginning of the college, then I was like, all right, we're just going full relationships. That's what we're doing. And unfortunately, I learned that you might be able to eat your ego through enlightenment, but it doesn't give you any energy. I know. You still need to have food. And so I learned to start caring more about these survival needs that I rejected, because it's very hard to practice spirituality when you don't have that base set up. Another example was not caring as much for grades as I should have in college, because I was like, oh, I'm not going to graduate school. I want to learn. I don't want to care about the grades. And yeah, that's an admirable belief to some degree. I think a lot of students care too much about grades, but I pulled it the other way. I was like, nah, I'm too spiritual for that letter, that number. I'm gonna practice my awakening. That's my A. Instead of the A plus I get on a test, is the A awakening that I get while I'm not studying. So yeah, that didn't work too well. I regret that now. I didn't get terrible grades. Still had like a pretty good GPA, but now I am going to graduate school. So I might have been a little bit more mindful about maybe my path will change back then. Another example is ignoring the pain of losing friendships from transformational conflict, because a spiritual person shouldn't need friends. So transformational conflict is when you start growing yourself and no longer can reconcile that with past friends, past values, past habits. Spiritual bypassing occurs when you say, okay, well, the pain of getting through that doesn't matter. That's just the growing pains of this transformation that I should be doing. But that's repressing the pain. You might repress it by saying everything happens for a reason, or I'm better than sadness, I'm better than anger, when in reality you might need to feel that pain before you can transcend and integrate it. Another example is me continuing to work in an exploitative work environment because I keep putting myself too much in the other person's shoes. I was avoiding my own loving shadow. That shadow causes me to be too intimate, too loving to romantic relationships, to work relationships too quickly. And I just keep putting myself in the other person's shoes to say like, oh, well, that's why they did this. And yeah, they might have been exploiting me for that reason. And yeah, I just kept staying in that environment way longer than I should have. Then we have spiritual oppression. which you might sublimate or evade negative emotions because they're non-spiritual. And the insight to navigate this is emotions are not negative or positive. They just are. It's the context that they're in which matters. They're messages from our subconscious, and it's up to us to decide what we do with that message. You could, for me, I avoided anger in relationships because I thought I was too good for anger. But in reality, that anger just turned it into resentment and blind compassion instead. So it finds a way to come back up, even if you don't realize it. The third and last trap that we can fall into for spiritual bypassing is deepening the ego instead of transcending it. In order to understand how this works, we need to understand what the false self actually is, what the ego is. The false self is the finite character that we build and attach to throughout life in order to help us survive physically and, very importantly, psychologically. This could be our values, our habits, the relationships, our major that we have. And self-survival is the process through which we continually recreate this identity through attachment, clinging to things being one way and suffering when they aren't. Continuing to validate being in that major or be in that friendship, or continuing to promote our avoidant tendencies by not staying in that major or not staying in that relationship. Now, the important insight here is sometimes building deeper into self-survival is actually what we need to do. Instead of transcending the self, we need to understand what self we're even transcending in the first place, which is where a lot of students might actually be in the ego development stages that I talk about more in my video on ego development for freshmen. But sometimes we can use spirituality to deepen the ego instead in spiritual materialism. We're like, look at me, I'm so spiritual. Look how good I am at yoga. Look how immersed I am in the LGBTQ community. Look at how woke I am. And this can be good in moderation, but it can also become its own identity that you defend. Like I do peanut butter if it's the last jar. And the insight is sometimes we need to transcend the self instead of building it up, instead of creating more illusions and ideology. What can those illusions and ideology look like? Could be astrology, could be holistic medicine, it could be psychedelics, could be self-help, could be chakras. The insight is that it doesn't really matter as much what the ideology or illusion is, it's rather the relationship you have to it. You're focusing, when you're building the ego up, you're focusing too much on content and not enough on structure. The content is the face value of the knowledge. The structure is your relationship to it. So for example, astrology. I fuck with astrology sometimes. I don't structure my relationship to it though in like a, yes, this is true. Absolutely. The astrological sign that you have, that's your soul personality, and it's a map for the rest of your life. No, I see it as the content. I see the face value of what it is. I see, okay, I can potentially use this as a mirror into myself, but I don't structure my relationship to it in a way where I'm like, it's ideological. And the insight here is that that can happen with anything. You can structure your relationship to science in an ideological way, to religion, or not. And so building up the ego happens when you focus too much on the content and not enough on the structure. When you're not skeptical about your skepticism. So those are the three big traps that we can fall into very easily in college. And the question is, how do we practice real spirituality? How do we navigate those traps? Well, it's just the reverse of each of them. Like, for example, instead of not building our structures and states, we build both of them. So we build an ecology of practices across quadrants of reality in both contemplation, reflection, and immersion. I know I just threw a lot of words at you, but what I mean by that, let's break it down one by one. Ecology of practices. This is a set of practices specific for you that check and balance each other. That's why you have a reflection, a contemplation, and an immersion practice. Because if you only had one, they wouldn't check and balance each other. You'd be too skewed in one direction. And that's why your ecology of practices should also be across quadrants. You're not just focusing on the self in your emotions and your thoughts, but also your body and your relationships and greater societal systems. So some examples could be me contemplating through these videos and articles that I write, me reflecting through journaling and meditation, and then me immersing through a book club like the Frida Book Club, Toastmasters, and my master's program. Could be religious Bible study, scientific lab work, dialogue with other religions, doesn't matter. Just a way of embodying your insights instead of just keeping it conceptual. Another way to do this is working on all your lines of development instead of just one. So instead of just building up your social development or your needs development, start building up your cognitive and your emotional and your physical. So that's how we focus on not just states, but also structures. And if you want to learn more about building states, check out my meditation video up above. And then for structures, check out my ego development map for college freshmen. Now, next trap to reverse engineer is lean into the pain and build your needs foundation instead of avoiding it. So for example, I'm focusing on my Orpheus shadow by purposely making relationships go slower, setting boundaries, and being more receptive to the other person's energy. Because I have this shadow where I'm too intimate, too fast. I give the ocean before they felt the tide. And this helps me be more mindful about that, be slower in my insane speed. Another example is getting a part-time job while doing my master's program at the Rijksmuseum. And this will help me build up that money foundation that I need in order to afford my studio rent and food while I'm doing the master's. And I don't see it as a unspiritual thing to do. I see it as spiritual because it gives me that survival base to focus on the higher things later on. That survival orientation plants the seed for spiritual flourishing. And also, the last way I'm doing this is I'm attuning to all my emotions with non-judgmental compassion, including the emotions that I see as non-spiritual, like anger, for example, which I long repressed. Now I'm really seeing it come up. Like one place it interestingly comes up is interactions with women. And it's not at any specific person for doing anything wrong, but just as like the situation that men and women in general have in heterosexual relationships, which is the guy is almost always expected culturally and also biologically to do the approach, which gives me anger and resentment sometimes because I'm so tired. I am really so tired of constantly being the one that does the approach. And I really wish it's happened a few times, but I really wish there was more of an expectation that it was both ways. Because it would be nice to not always have to be the one putting more energy at the get-go. So I don't reject that anger and resentment. I rather feel it and try and act with it in a mindful way. And then finally, deconstruct and transcend the ego. Don't just deepen it. Embody deeper in understanding your structure to the content in your life, whether that's astrology or the classes that you're taking, and try and go deeper in structure. Where if you want to go deeper in that, check out my meta, the most undervalued college freshman skill, I believe it's called, that goes into the meta hexagon, and also my video on spiral knowing, which goes deeper into learning and meta learning so you can structure your knowledge to something deeper. Loosen your spiritual ego. Don't judge people because of the stage of development they're at overly, which you can very easily get into when you're first getting into human development. Root more and more into how you're you're creating your experience of reality. How do your parts make you perceive college the way that you do? How do your attachments, your avoidances make you perceive things the way you do? Become more humorous. Humor loosens your grip on yourself. It's a very interesting way to say humor. Instead of just belly rumbles, it's actually loosening the attachment that you have to yourself. You can check out my humor video up above, how to get more funny in college. So our work in college is not to see spiritual bypassing as something terrible. Oh, spiritual bypassing, why does it have to exist? Why couldn't we just bypass spiritual bypassing? Unfortunately, bypassing spiritual bypassing is its fourth trap. So our work is not to try and skip over it as fast as possible. It's to try and navigate it with grace by knowing the traps beforehand and then reverse engineering them so that we can make it less extreme. Every part of college can be a part of our spiritual work if we're mindful enough. Using the toilet and realizing there's no toilet paper can be a part of our spiritual work. It's all a part of navigating the beauty that is spiritual bypassing. That's it. Check out my free college freshman journaling kit in the description below. It's a gamified journaling system that helps you grow your emotional intelligence, self-understanding, and purpose with 1,000 journaling questions in just 15 minutes a day. You can see that in the description below. As always, I hope you have a splentastic, phenomenal rest of your day. Eat some peanut butter, and goodbye.